Good evening, friends. I'm Asha Nayaswami. We're continuing with this commentary on the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda, the inspiration and teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us that we may absorb the wisdom of this great scripture. Help us to know deep within our hearts and in our souls why these words have lived for so many centuries, and why in this moment the consciousness of the great masters can reach us directly, their wisdom thoughts, but above all their vibration of divine experience. Help us to live always in the presence of thy infinite love. Om. Peace. Amen. Let's just have a moment of silence and then we'll start. Om, peace. Amen. Every time I deal with this book, almost every time, if I'm wide awake and listening at all, it's just the wisdom in here is just incredible. Incredible, actually, Swami would correct me on that, meaning not credible. That's what incredible actually means. But it is, it's amazing, it's awesome that it really is just. I was joking, saying that no wonder instead of rewriting a new scripture, Master just reinterprets this one, because it's multi-level applicability, and its extraordinary timelessness. This was the Battle of Kurukshetra. This was hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but it's just vibrantly alive right in this moment. Now, it is true that this is a new translation of it. A new, I guess translation is the actual word, except Swami didn't start from Sanskrit. Master wrote a literal translation of the Bhagavad Gita, and Swamiji had Master's literal translation, and he had several other translations in front of him, and he refined some of the language to make it clear. So it's a somewhat of a new expression, even though because it didn't start from the original. But still, it's just how nothing changes. I mean, there's this reality of human nature, and actually these are the sections that we're dealing with. How long has this teaching just been going on and on and on and on? And it's millions of years, literally. Master says, I believe it's in this one of these that we're reading today, that the course of mankind, here it is. My guru once stated that the time span of human history covers 50 million years. I mean, that's really a long time. And that the nature of consciousness has always been the same. I mean, 50 million sounds enormous to a human mind. I myself, it's almost 51 years since I first met Swamiji in the end of November. So it's within a month. It's over 50 years. And I must say, a little bit impishly, I love to say, I met Swami 50 years ago. And I chuckle every time I say that, because it's a quick way to communicate something. When I say that, it gives a picture very quickly sort of what my life has been about, and the degree to which I have any credibility for the things that I'm saying. That's a fast way to say it. For a person who's had to write a lot of advertising and has had to say exactly everything you want to say in just a little tiny square, because I worked with print advertising for so long. You get succinct ways of saying things. I used to say about Swami Kriyananda that, let me think how we put it, you know, his at that time, he's written over 100 books which have been translated into 30 different languages and are distributed in 120 countries. Because you write that sentence out, or you can even just say his books have been translated into 30 languages and are available in over 100 countries. And you have to stop for a minute and just think about that. I was looking up a particular person who's, I'd heard about them and I was interested, and it said their book was on the New York Times bestsellers list for 2 years. And I thought, whoa, that also says something. Just like these very short statements. So all that I'm commenting about is 50 million years from the human perspective. 50 years from the purpose of one incarnation seems like a long time. 50 million years from the human perspective seems long. But as Swami memorably said to me once, all time is short compared to eternity. I mean, we don't even know where to put that in our minds because we're just so trapped in a human mind. But for 50 million years, human beings have been working with the chakras and the spiritual eye. The most astonishing thing you have to think about is when we merge with the infinite, the closer we get to the divine, the more our consciousness expands, the more we enter into a zone in which time, which looms so enormous to the ordinary consciousness, where time has no meaning. Swamiji talks about the book of Brighu, which is this book, ancient book of prophecy, written from a much higher age, that it'll be hundreds and hundreds of years before this planet reaches that stage, and we won't necessarily be here because if it's not karmically appropriate for us to be in that advanced stage, we won't be in it. It's not like we can sort of grip the earth and just hang on until we don't have to work on our own consciousness. We just hang out until we get to Satya Yuga. No, the body will die before that happens. Swami, he laughed so much when he heard whether it was really a true story or not. A man went to a psychic, I think it's a joke. A man went to a psychic to find out who he would be in his next life so he could will his fortune to that person. There was another one. How did it work? I think this was actually somebody's actual idea, that somehow or another you would give your money to this company with a number of secret codes that you could come back in your next life and then you could pick up the money. I don't know if that was a joke or not. That might have been an urban legend, but that was also very, very clever. I mean, people have so many things, and people, want to freeze their bodies so that when, I don't know, a cure for their disease comes or something, I'm not quite sure, but I'm not sure that one is a joke. Just this, we have this very strange misunderstanding about what the nature of life is and where our happiness comes from, but the Gita knows differently. And Krishna sat there and he talked to Arjuna, and when the time he was talking to Arjuna, Krishna knew that you and I would be sitting here right now studying this book of Brighu, this ancient book of prophecy that Swami was talking about. It was written thousands of years ago, not merely hundreds, but thousands of years ago. And it still exists. There are various pundits around India who have possession. They call it a book, but it's sort of bundles of written pages. And they're in numerous different places around India, and various pundits have access to this book. And Brighu was an ancient sage. I believe he's mentioned in the Gita as one of the greatest of the ancient sages. And Swamiji had they call it a reading twice from different pundits who had that book. And you walk in and you either give your horoscope, your birth date and time, and then they cast a horoscope. In one case, and this might have been, there's another sage, Agastya, but there was another one where they do it from your thumbprint, and then through that they can search their files or their collections, and they'll find the one that's yours. Sometimes they find a few choices, and the pundit will say, are you from England? Did you marry at the age of 21? Yes or no. And if the answer is no, then they'll keep going. But then, Swamiji said, they read one where they described who he was, where he was born, who his parents were, that he had brothers and no sisters, what his English name was, which no one in India even knew what his English name was, what the name of his guru was, and various other details about his life that were exact, just exactly what his life had been from thousands of years ago. And he said it was impossible. They said, you have two brothers, but no living sister is possible, although one will die in your mother's womb. That's what this said. Swami did not know that his mother had even had a miscarriage. When he went back and saw her, he asked her, she said, yes, she had a miscarriage. At that time, there was no of the ultrasound and so on, so there was no way to know whether it was a girl or not. But Swami himself didn't know that a sibling of his had died in his mother's womb. But Brighu knew that. And what I'm saying with this is it just takes time and it just erases it. In that age, the age of Satya Yuga, an elevated age, any sage could do this. Any God-realized master can dissolve time. But that whole age, time becomes dissolved. In this age, we're dissolving space to a certain extent. Right. Because I can pick up my phone and I can talk to my friends in India. We can communicate. Distance is no problem. Time is still a problem, though. The people who have passed on from this world who are yet to be born, I can't relate to them. But wisdom is timeless. That's why we use that phrase, timeless wisdom. What does that mean? That means it stands completely outside of the details of the life that we're living now. These are concepts that we use these words a lot, but we don't always stand back with sufficient awe, is actually the word I want to use, to realize sort of what we're working with. That Krishna and Arjuna on the field of battle had a conversation about wisdom. And here we are in front of this camera, dissolving space itself, and time for that matter, because this recording will be accessible certainly for a while. I don't know about forever, but certainly for a long time, long after the body that's expressing these words has been consigned to the flames. The thoughts will still be there. It's quite remarkable. It just gets very interesting, isn't it? Changes our perspective on a lot of things. A friend of mine, I'm going to add one more point to this. A friend of mine who passed away, I don't know, at least maybe 20 years ago. She had cancer. She knew there was no hope for her. It was past the point of treatment. She was extremely courageous. She was a very strong devotee, and just her approach to life. She was committed to life while it was here, but when it was ending, it was just ending. She just had a very adult conversation with her doctor about the end of life process, made certain decisions, and then just followed through without flinching. But at the very end, and many of you have heard me say this before, but it's remarkable to contemplate, the last few days of her life, she was on her deathbed. Deathbed is exactly it. More movement than just lying there was not possible to her. But she said to a friend, she says, I'm lying here, and she said, passing before my eyes are hundreds and hundreds, perhaps she said thousands, I'm not sure, of faces. She said, and I recognize that every single one of them has been my face. And so she said, it's very, very hard to be concerned about losing the one I'm wearing now, when you just think of all the faces that you've lost before, all the lifetimes in which this was me, and I looked into the mirror and this was me. I've had, I have this inclination sometimes, and I have to resist it because I honestly feel that it's driven me to madness in the past. But I'm trying to be able to regard it without having that kind of panic. Now, let me just add something interesting in here. There was a certain point when more than one friend of mine had a psychotic break from reality. And I know sometimes people think that if you go mentally unbalanced, it's always a spiritual experience. I don't think that's always true. although it's always an existential response to the unbearableness of human existence. That I do understand. A massive dive into a completely subjective world because the objective world has become too much to handle. I understand that too. But what I think about sometimes, and I've thought about this since I was 18. This is when I was 18 is when I first remember thinking about it. And it was a powerful incentive to come on the spiritual path, which is the inescapability of consciousness. I mean, a friend of mine was terrified from a very young age of death because he was afraid of annihilation. And as a child, he would wake up in the night sobbing about death. I mean, like when he was 5 or 6 years old. And his parents would try to comfort him by assuring him that death wasn't going to come for a long, long time. But he was of a very philosophical mind, even as a young child, in the context of childhood. But he had a very difficult time explaining to them it wasn't the timing of death, it was the fact of death. And in his thinking at that point, it meant annihilation. He was terrified at the idea of the annihilation of consciousness. And at a relatively young age, about the age of 20, 21, he discovered self-realization. And of course, when he began to understand the true nature of consciousness, of course, the fear went away completely. My fear was the opposite, or my existential crisis has been the opposite. It's the absolute inescapability of consciousness, that I'm just always here. And it's interesting, even as I say it, I feel this little bit of anxiety coming into me. I used to joke about it when I lived at the convent at Ayodhya. We called it the convent. If you went there, it didn't look anything like a convent. It was the forest with a bunch of little trailers scattered around. And we had a teepee for a temple. It was a wonderful time of life. A crowd of 10 or 12 of us. The numbers varied. It got more crowded toward the end. Let's see, but almost every morning we would get up and we would meditate together. We didn't meditate long together, but we got up at the same time, would energize and meditate together for half an hour or 45 minutes. Then we'd go back and meditate longer on our own. It was actually a very nice way to do it because it kept us very tight. And the woman who was in charge, Seva, with a gentle hand, ruled us with an iron fist. And all she would have to do if you didn't come to meditation would say, "We didn't see you this morning." And then you were there every morning after that. She had a lot of magnetism in a very positive way. So pretty much every morning we were all there. You just didn't skip it. But for quite a few years, we would just meditate together, just this small group in this little teepee. And there was such a feeling of divine unity with those women there. One of us, I believe, I think only one has passed from this world. The rest of us are somewhat scattered, but there's a unique bond there. But it used to, scattered within Ananda, none of that original group left, actually. We all lived to the end with Ananda. One exception. Coming back to it, but it was so remarkable to me that we could go in there every day, we could become so unified. And the way I joked about it was, but we'd all take home the right consciousness. I would walk in as myself and I would walk out as myself. And I could never figure out, why didn't I turn into one of my sisters? It was like our consciousness would merge. And how do it know which one to take back? But every time, it always knew which one to take back. And I would take myself back. But that was the remnant of my existential concern, that I will always be conscious. But what I've gradually come to understand, you see, is the unbearable part of that is the feeling of limitation. When I was younger, I didn't understand, I didn't know how to articulate what it was about life as it was being presented to me that was so unattractive to me. And only after I got the vocabulary of self-realization did I understand what was so unattractive to it. But I had my theory about how I was going to solve the problem based on what I wasn't able to articulate. I know that's a lot of words that didn't say anything, so let me say it right. I was very concerned about the integrity of the options that were open to me. I could see that a great deal of life involved compromise. Compromise of ideals, compromise of talents, compromise of opportunities. It was just obvious to me. And even a level of corruption. And I don't mean like real evil, but just cutting corners or not quite saying it like it is. I was very, very concerned just about being able to live the purity of the ideals that I felt inside of me. So I had this idea that I would raise children, that I would be a mother, because that seemed to me somehow, there seemed to be a purity in that attracted me. It was meaningful. It was just within my purview to do it. I was naive, of course, but nonetheless, that's how I thought. And also, I saw myself as the mother of a great big brood of children. And in retrospect, what I was trying to do, and this is when I got the vocabulary, I felt so limited. And what I was limited by was my egoic identification with my self-definition as an ego, which automatically separated me from all of creation and confined me to this tiny reality. So I thought if I could physically multiply, then I wouldn't feel so confined. That was at least the theory. And in those days, the concept of a woman just getting married, finding a husband, becoming a mother, it was, some of my mentors wanted me to do, quote, more than that. But I didn't think what they were presenting to me was more than that. So I resented even the thought of that concept. But then what happened was I discovered self-realization. And when I discovered self-realization, I realized that I could have 100 children and I would still be confined to my ego. That the ego was the issue. And basically, almost from morning to night, I just shifted. I just shifted over. That was when I met Swami Kriyananda, and I realized there was a life I could have that would actually help me to escape from this unbearable confinement of being myself. And I just gave up almost like, as I said, from night to morning, and I've never conceived a child, and I've never seriously wanted to except for about 30 minutes when someone put a newborn baby in my hands, one of my godchildren. And while I was holding him, I thought, wow, this would be nice. Of course, you don't really have a baby, you have a person. So the idea that you have a baby is a very short-lived idea. So about 30 minutes later, I was done with it, but there was the moment when I got to do it. But the end point of all of that, and this is where I was going, is the fact that every morning I wake up and I'm still myself. But the only way out of this is to simply lose the self. So the idea of being conscious is not the obstacle. It's being limited in our consciousness and therefore constantly having to relate to this one. And I've made friends with this one. I used to not be as friendly toward her as I feel now. I feel kind of sympathetic to her situation. I used to be much more judgmental of who she was. Now she's a pretty nice person and I don't mind so much. But it would be nice to get rid of her. That's what seclusion is. I used to joke that I could never take a short seclusion because it took me at least 3 days to get rid of her. And then once I got rid of her, I had a really nice seclusion, but 3 days wasn't, if I only had a 3-day seclusion, she wouldn't leave. It'd take a little more time for her to leave. And I've gotten a little better at it, self-forgetfulness. So I finally realized that's what self-realization is self-forgetfulness, small s, self-forgetfulness. It ceases to exist. And when the small self ceases to exist, automatically what's there is the infinite self. And that's it. Nothing else will satisfy. You can plunge in. I was starting to say some of my friends had psychotic breaks with reality, temporary in all cases, thank you. Very grateful for that. But in several cases, I mean, I guess I have a lot of friends like this, but in 2 cases in particular, trying to think if I really have more than 2. No, there's only these 2. In both cases, I felt like it was an existential crisis, spiritual crisis. And interestingly, Swami said to me, and I believe he was also talking to me, he said, madness is a stage on the path to spiritual growth. I said, wow, that's really something to think about. He said, because at a certain point, the ego, the self, stands on the edge and it sees what is being asked of it. It realizes that there is no exit from the unbearable nature of awareness except to transcend it completely in infinity. And the magnitude of that task just causes the mind to say, no thank you. And objective reality, because spirituality is objective. It's an objective truth. I started this long half-hour dissertation talking about the centuries and centuries ago. These words were spoken and they're timeless. It's absolutely true. The problem of human suffering, the real cause of human suffering, the real source of human happiness has never changed in 50 million years. It's not going to change today. Whether we're, on this planet, on another planet, whether we have internet or whether we live in the Stone Age, human consciousness has always been the same and the problem is always the same. And there comes a point where you're looking at it and something in you begins to realize every single delusion that I'm holding, thinking it's going to give me happiness, I'm going to have to face it completely. I'm going to have to recognize its limitations. I'm going to have to let it go. And I mean, I'd rather not. It's just really simple. I'd rather just be perfectly happy but not do all that work. And that's why we take drugs and get wealthy and become wild sensualists and thieves and murderers and autocrats and dictators and nuns and monks and anchorites, and we just keep trying to find out until step by step, the road narrows and there's just no choice. There's no choice but this one. And at a certain point, well, I suppose there's always, the ego is always a little afraid until, because it knows it's its death story. I'm not qualified to really speak about that. But we have no choice. Just as simple as that. When Swami once was asked, what's the key to success on the spiritual path? He said that you realize it's a matter of life or death, which everything other than to continue my spiritual search is living hell, is death. And you just, like all gates behind you have slammed. I have a friend, God willing, he'll soon be released from prison. His name is Jairam, some of you know him. And he's in a much lower security prison at this point, but when I first met him maybe 25 years ago, I met him longer ago than that, but about 25 years ago he was in maximum security at Folsom. And I visited him there on a number of occasions, and prison is prison. By the time you get all the way inside, you're sitting in what feels like a multi-purpose room of a middle school with families and adults, in this case a men's prison, so everybody's visiting a man. There are armed guards around the edges, but you're just sitting at these tables. But to get there, you go through a whole series of what you would call airlocks, except it's not actually air. You walk, there's a lock door. It opens, you step inside, it clangs shut behind you. Then another one opens, you move forward, it clangs shut behind you. You go through a number of these kind of steps of opening, closing, and there is a sound, which we've all seen in the movies, and it's real. When you've moved in through one and that thing closes behind you and it smashes shut, this big steel sound, wham! And you're not, I'm a visitor. I could get out. If I were a prisoner, of course it would be different. But even as a visitor, there's a certain The first time I got more accustomed to it, but there was always just this little bit of feeling about it. But that's what you see happens on the spiritual path. You just, and it's positive. You reach a certain level of understanding of where could I go, Lord? What else could I do? But the whole world of possibilities just slams shut behind you. And it's not even that you want to go back. Because I was thinking recently, just, my tastes and my inclinations have just changed a great deal over the course even of this incarnation, and God knows over the course of many. I've had enough what I believe are true past life memories to know that, well, I'll just put it like this. We used to have Halloween parties as a kind of a way to let off steam. It started at Ananda village. There were so few options. We really threw ourselves into a Halloween party. That tradition has grown now to this incredible family-oriented, fabulous Halloween at Ananda village. But it started just with us when we had no children even to celebrate with. But it was just a way to let off steam. And that tradition carried even as we moved to Palo Alto for a number of years. And I remember we had a Halloween costume party, and it was a come as you were costume party. So you just picked out your favorite past life and you came that way. And this one man, he came all in black with a lot of soot on his face, like this. What were you? He said, well, in a past life, I was a lot darker than I am now. I thought that was really a brilliant one. So we were all a lot darker. But in regard to one of those lifetimes, a woman and I who didn't get along with each other, both had past life experiences that Swami endorsed as true, in which, think about pretty much the most horrible thing a person could do to someone else with creative imagination, not just, like something as unimaginative as just to shoot someone in the head, but, like the real, let me ruin your life, let me diabolically ruin your life. She did it to me, I did it to her. Swami said, I'm inclined to believe both your lives were true. Really. But then he said, but neither of you would ever do that again because you've suffered so much from behaving that way. Oh yeah, that's right. That's why that door slams shut. So you're standing right here. The only way is forward because that gate is slammed. And it's not slammed because you couldn't turn around. You're not a prisoner. You could walk right back out. You could walk right back out to any life you wanted. But you can't because you've gone too far. You've seen too much. You know too much. So the only way out is forward, whatever that might be. And then into our lives comes the Bhagavad Gita and a self-realized master to take us there. So all of that was on the word timeless, my friends, and my profound appreciation and gratitude for all who came before us to pave the way. So now we're going to start with stanza 4, verse 3. And he says, oh, this is a beautiful verse anyway. Today I have taught you, this is Krishna speaking, today I have taught you, my devotee and friend. That's Krishna speaking to Arjuna, my devotee and friend, that ancient science of yoga, the secret to the highest blessings for mankind. So Swamiji talks a little bit here about that word friend. Nothing in a great scripture is accidental. And the most remarkable things about the great words of the great masters is just how fraught with meaning they are. So yes, of course, Arjuna is Krishna's devotee, although, as is often true, it was a leela. That's a wonderful Sanskrit word for which there is no actual translation in English. The word we use is play. We call it the play. But it's the play of God. Leela is the play of God. That the divine is playing with us. And what that means is not just, playing patty cakes or ring around the rosy or pick up sticks or something like that. The Lord is having fun with us. He's just having fun. He's taking on a costume and he's having fun. In our community here, we're about to have a fundraising event, and as part of the event, a group of people have written a very humorous skit, and we're going to make a skit, and it's going to be just really a delight. And because I'm the keeper of the costume closet, I was up there pulling out all the costumes, and it's going to be fun. And there's no reason in the world why we have to do it. I mean, it'll be a lot of work, and people put out a lot of time, and we'll do it just for the joy of it, because it'll make everyone laugh, and it'll uplift everybody's energy, and it'll cause us to feel, awestruck and moved and touched by the power of God, and just all these things, that's the play of God, that's the Leela. So when Krishna and Arjuna incarnate together, because the tradition is, Master said that he was Arjuna, and that Babaji has said that he incarnated as Krishna. So here we are. I'm going to talk about this in another place in these commentaries. But the masters, once they attain self-realization, most of those who attain spiritual freedom, as Swami said, just move into the infinite and remain there. These are words that I have no idea what they actually mean. But he said there are those who have such compassion for the suffering of humankind that they again and again take a physical body. Greater can no love be than this, from a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and death for the sacrifice of mankind, for the salvation of mankind. Such ever has been the sacrifice of the great masters for the world. This is what we say in the Festival of Light, the ritual that Swamiji received and transmitted to us. This is what the masters do. And so once a master decides that, his divine bliss is to keep returning to the prison of human existence and help liberate others, they just come again and again. Master said again and again, 1 trillion times if necessary. He would, over crags of suffering with bleeding feet, he would come as long as one stray brother is left behind. So the tradition is that Arjuna and Krishna were long since liberated, but they took the roles, they took the parts, they put on the costumes, and they made the story, the Leela. They played the Leela. I am the devotee and thou art my master. But it is true that the relationship of the guru and the disciple continues even after realization is attained. Because even after they have become equal, nonetheless the power that liberated you, it's always the cause for gratitude. The human life is just like that. There's a particular woman friend of mine. We met when we were both about 20. And she met Swami Kriyananda before I did, and it was because of her she suggested that I should go hear him speak. I've met a real teacher, she said, and I think you'll like him. Really, truer words that were never spoken to me in my whole life. But because of that tie, I'm eternally grateful to her. She was the instrument. God had to use some instrument. She was the instrument who brought me to what has been the entire definition of my life. Imagine the gratitude the disciple feels to the master when, through the grace of that guru, all delusion is overcome and freedom becomes yours. How could you ever forget? But at the same time, a relationship develops of a different kind. Swami Kriyananda talked, I remember now, let me think what the details were. I was trying to think, I unfortunately, it was a dream, but I can't quite conjure the details of it. I have one experience in my mind, and I'm not entirely certain about this part of it. But this was the relevant point. Swamiji was there with Master, and this was toward the end of Swami's life, and he was there with Master in the dream. He said, except what was so touching to him about the dream was when Swamiji was with Master in the incarnation of Kriyananda and Yogananda, Swamiji was 22 years old when he met Master, and Master would already have been in his mid-50s, late 50s, because Master died, I believe he was 59 when he died. Do I have that right? Something like that. I'm so terrible at math. But he wasn't very old. 1893 to, can you do the math? 58, 59. Yeah, 58, 59. My friend Keshava, who's better at numbers than I am, just told me that. So Swamiji was 22, and 3.5 years, so he was in his mid-50s. 3.5 years later, Master died. So Swamiji was a young disciple, not just young chronologically, but also young, 3.5 years. When I asked Swamiji once, when I was just joking with Swamiji, teasing him is actually the right word, and I suddenly felt that maybe my behavior was impudent and just really inappropriate. Because after all, Swami was my link to Master, and I owe him everything spiritually. And there I was just being so, well, was I being over-familiar was sort of the question. I said, did you ever tease Master? And Swami immediately said, oh no. He said, no. I was much too much in awe of him. He said, I never could have. But then, and I've shared this with you before, Swami said in 1968, which was now like, what would that have been, 20 years later? 58, 10 years later. Swami met Anandamoyi Ma in India and spent much time with her over the 4 years that Swami was in India. He said with Ma, he had the kind of relationship that he was, quote, too young to have had with Master, meaning Swami was able to just relax and be himself and not be so filled with awe that he couldn't be spontaneous. He said Dr. Lewis, who was Master's first disciple, and they met they were both in their 20s when they met, and they sort of grew up together. That Dr. Lewis, even though he held Master in the same regard, the relationship he had to him was more man to man in a certain way. Now, the point is, in this dream that Swami had, he was with Master, but Swami said the notable feature of the dream was that he and Master were, as Swami put it, just, did he use the word man? He might have, but they were equals. They were two men together working for a common cause. And Swami was still the disciple, but the relationship had shifted so that they were partners in what they were doing. It was no longer that Master was the master and Swami was the chela, and they were working like that, which of course was the truth of it, but they had become friend, just exactly like that. So this, when Krishna speaks to Arjuna like that, he's commending Arjuna. He's also giving to Arjuna the full respect and recognition that Arjuna himself is now embracing this reality. And I often quote the Bible, but it's the same thing. Jesus, toward the end of his life, said to his close disciples, "You call me master, but I call you friend." And then he went on to speak of the fact that a friend stands shoulder to shoulder, and we share the burden, and we work together. He said the servant works for the master, but the servant, he's always doing his master's work, and it's never his own. But at a certain point, the disciple, first of all, he has to reach the same consciousness as the guru, but he also has to develop the same attitude as the guru. He has to come to the point where I'm not doing this because you're telling me to do it. I'm doing it because this is who I am. And I remember, and it was a gradual process, so there were notable turning points in the course of my life where I stepped further and further into this. But I observed myself, how it gradually moved from I'm doing this because Swami's doing this and I do what Swami does, to the point where even if there were no Swamiji, this is what I would do. I had that experience. It was interesting. One of the first times I traveled to India by myself, and it might have even been the first time I traveled to India by myself, But I went through, I took Asiana Airlines, I think is what it was called, and I went through South Korea, and I stopped in Seoul, South Korea, and I had maybe 4 hours or something. I was completely alone in a country I'd never been in. Of course, I was just in the airport, but I was thousands of miles from everybody. And I don't know if we had email or internet then. We must have had it, of course, but I didn't sit down and open my computer. Whatever was going on, I didn't. And I remember just thinking, what if? What if something happened? And, the world broke apart at this point. And I would be here in South Korea. And, in my imagination, we were still having a modern life. But nonetheless, I was trapped in South Korea and I would never be able to leave. What would I do? I'm entirely alone. Well, of course, first I would have to learn Korean. So I thought of every refugee story I ever heard of, where I would have to start cleaning hotel rooms because I didn't speak the language and I wouldn't be able to do anything but menial work. And I would have to learn the language and I would have to support myself until I learned the language and could open an Ananda center. That's what I would do. That would be just what I would have to do because there is no alternative. That's who I am. I mean, that's actually that's a very powerful realization. And I don't know why Krishna called Arjuna friend, what the multiple meanings are, but thinking of it the way Jesus used the word, it would because I'm not doing this because you told me. I'm doing this because this is who I am. This is my destiny as well. And that puts it on a very different footing. That's very much about what I've also often talked about also, which is how our spirituality grows within us. And it's not something that we put on to wear. It's that it swells and it becomes our entire entity, that when you go inside, there's nothing else. There's a beautiful story about Hanuman, who was the absolutely devoted to Lord Rama and to Sita. Hanuman happens to be a monkey, the way the story is told, and he's the head of the monkey army, and he's a great soldier, so that when Rama's wife Sita is kidnapped by the evil Ravana, and Rama has to go and rescue his wife, and Hanuman helps him. And the fact that Hanuman is a monkey with magical powers comes in very useful through the whole thing. But somewhere in the story, and I don't even remember the details now, but somehow in the story there's some challenge to Rama, to Hanuman, as to who is he and what is he. And in the story, Rama opens his chest, physically pulls apart his chest so that you can see his heart. And in his heart, there's an image of Rama and Sita. And there's a beautiful picture that hangs in this house of Hanuman opening his chest, and his very physical heart has become imprinted with the image of Rama and Sita. It's not something that he wears from the outside. It absolutely emanates from who he has become. And at that point, the Lord can call you friend, because now there's no difference between us. So absolutely beautiful. So then chapter 4, verse 4, then Arjuna says, okay, now he's making a reference back to verses 1 and 2 of chapter 4, in which Krishna says to Arjuna, he traces the whole descent of yoga from the beginning of time. And Krishna says, I gave this yoga to Vivishvat passed it on to Manu, and so on. I read this a few weeks ago. So now Arjuna is saying this. Vivasat lived in far-off antiquity, whereas you are of recent birth. Arjuna is looking at Krishna and says, how could you have given this to Vivasvat? I mean, I'm doing the math and it doesn't really work, okay? You are of recent birth. How am I to take this statement that it was you who first taught this yoga to mankind? Because that's what Krishna is saying. I taught this yoga. So it gets really interesting at this point. Let me see. let me just think, because this was so interesting the way he said it. I want to, let's see. Just, I'm trying to get this. This is what we're talking about. Well, Swamiji uses this opportunity to talk about something that he became very interested in, Swami himself. Krishna, Master made statements about the past lives of our lines of masters. And it's very important when I say these things. I'm not trying to be at all to be sectarian. And by no means am I claiming that this is the only spiritual family in the world. This just happens to be my spiritual family. Just in a human family, you would talk about what your ancestors did and what your grandfather did and who your uncle was and, at the time of William the Conqueror, where your people were. All these sorts of things. Because there's a beauty to your own family. And also it gives one, you sink ever deeper into appreciation of it. And so Master made the statement that he had been Arjuna and that Babaji had been Krishna. He spoke of of King Janaka, who was from the era of Rama and Sita that I was referring to, that Lahiri Mahashaya had been King Janaka, who was a king of enormous wealth. And in other places, Swamiji has said that one of the reasons that Babaji manifested that golden palace for Lahiri was not so much that Lahiri had a desire for that palace, but that Lahiri had lived in such a palace. And it was sort of I'll put it like this. Swami tells a story about Oliver Black, who was a very advanced disciple of Master. And once Oliver Black was visiting in Encinitas with Master, and he was there in the ashram, and it was a terrifically rainy day. It was just pouring rain there by the seacoast. He gets a call from Master, and Master says, I'm going out for a drive, by the ocean and beautiful views. Would you like to come with me? And Oliver looks out the window, and it's just pouring rain. It's like not a time when you go out to sightsee in the car. But well, if Master wants to go out in the rain, that's fine with me. So Oliver says, of course. And he starts to walk out, and he just basically has to walk out of his room and down a short hallway to the front door of the ashram. So he goes into the inner hallway. He walks to the front door. By the time he gets to the front door, the sky is completely blue. There's not a rain cloud in sight, and the ground is dry. And Oliver just looks, and he looks at Master, and Master smiles at him and says, "For you, Oliver," like that. And Swami just comments, what Master was just in charge of the planet, the whole weather system. And also the way he said it to Oliver, just for you, just a little gesture for you. This is Leela. This is the personification of Leela, the exemplification of Leela, the divine just playing in a certain way. Swamiji remarked, God will only work such a miracle for a very, very great soul, for Oliver, who would understand it in the right way. And so whenever I think about Lahiri being King Janaka and Babaji manifesting that golden palace, you can sort of see Babaji leaning over to Lahiri and saying, for you, my son. This was an incarnation we enjoyed, or you enjoyed, so we'll just do it again, just for fun like this. So Swamiji talks about, that by the end of Swami's life, he'd begun to feel that perhaps these masters have been like in charge of this planet for even thousands and thousands of years. They've just been coming back and coming back. Babaji as Babaji became Krishna. It wasn't that after he was Krishna, he became Babaji. Let me see, do I have that correct? No, I don't know. Babaji only said that he was Krishna. So who knows? I was adding something to that wasn't true. I've always thought it was true, though, somehow. But that's because I just made that up. I have absolutely no source for that. But Babaji has said in this incarnation that he would keep his body through this, cycle of time. It's just, he was about to cast off his body and he said, no, I won't. I'll just keep it for however long it's needed. All time is short compared to eternity. The mind boggles. But the heart just fills up with this, seriously to contemplate it, really seriously and deeply to realize how closely associated we are with this line of gurus. Some of us have known Swami Kriyananda, who is a great disciple in this great lineage, a fully realized master. Master said by the end of his life, Swami was, that death would be his final sacrifice. Well, there are many things, I've written all about it. I don't have to say it, but a great soul. He was there with Master. We're this close. We're within living memory of these great souls. And even more than that, we have a personal relationship with these great souls. This is not like we're sitting in a stadium of 10,000 and there's some little preacher down there talking into the microphone, and afterwards we say, wow, that was a great speech. This is when Master was living, and he said something to Swamiji. He corrected something erroneous that Swami had said when Swami was completely at a distance from Master, and no one else was there to witness it. And then Master corrected something that Swamiji said. And Swami's first response was, you know? You knew what I said? And Master looked at him and said, I know every thought you think. And Swami said it wasn't that he was worried about that. He was just astonished. He'd never really thought about it. When I was with Swamiji once at Disneyland, of all places, where there were hundreds of people around us, Swami just suddenly went into this extremely deep spiritual bhav, and looking at all those people, Swami just said, imagine, he said, not merely loving all these people, which in itself was a tremendous thought, but being all these people. He said, that was Master's consciousness. We can throw words like omnipresent, omniscient, one with God. We are all one with God. But when you really stop and contemplate that, and Swami then said to Master, I know every thought you think, because Swami has invited him into his consciousness. Bear in mind, open your heart to me and I will enter. If we close ourselves off, he won't intrude. But Swami had invited him. I know every thought you think. I said to Swamiji, Swami, is that still true? Swami looked at me and said quite simply, of course. So here we are, those of us who have made this decision, and anybody can make this decision. No institution, formal initiation is wonderful, but it's not necessary. In the purification ceremony, the disciple, this is what we do. Swami again created this many decades ago. I seek purification by the grace of God, one says, meaning I want God to change me. And then the light bearer says, the Master says, open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life. St. John said, to all who received him, to all who opened their heart and asked him to come in, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God. That Swami said, how did he put it? To be infinite in your consciousness also means that you are infinitesimal in your consciousness. And I consider myself to be the infinitesimal part of it. The Master is aware of every thought I think if I invite him in. That's how close we are. How could you be closer than that? Of something that is millions of years old, that has always been the same. When one of Master's disciples said, because he was struggling so much, one of Master's disciples said to him, I don't think I have very good karma, sir, because he was struggling so much. Master said, and I can't say it with the power that Swami repeats these lines, but Master said, you have very, 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 very good karma, even to want to know God. You know, and we must hold to this. This is our raft over the ocean of delusion. Just close both of your hands and all of your heart over that reality. Just never let it go. And they'll take us home. It's really quite a promise. Worth meditating on, worth thinking about every minute of every day. I am the disciple of a great master, and I have very, very, very good karma. Isn't that marvelous? One more thought. Jesus said, you know, because you love me, the world won't love you. Meaning that, you know, you'll be out of step with the world around you. You'll have to be your own. But then Jesus said, but don't worry, here's the good news. I have conquered the world. That's us. That's us, my friends. That's the good news. Our masters are in charge, and they'll take us home. God bless you.